That's all I got. I also want to thank the American Institute for Progressive Democracy. Andy and the others who have set this up, I really appreciate it. This is a wonderful opportunity, and I don't, as I said to students in my classes yesterday, I don't get a chance to give talks like this a lot where I'm not doing the kind of guarded classroom thing. My job in a classroom is to help students learn not to reproduce myself, and so I don't necessarily tell them what I think about stuff, and I don't really try to get them to think what I think. But when I give a talk, I can say what I think about this stuff, and so here we go. Okay, so what I want to do is talk about whether education is an effective response to this. And I want to get beyond platitudes, because we have platitudes all the time when we talk about this stuff. Let me grab my watch. And you can see these platitudes. You know these platitudes. I mean, this is these are all about the American dream. This is Bill Clinton's notion about working hard and playing by the rules and getting ahead. That's the American dream. The wealthiest man on the planet says something similar. He's only worth about $75 billion, so we should feel, yeah. We must demand strong schools so that young Americans enter the workforce with the math, science, and problem-solving skills they need to succeed. The current president says this almost exactly the same as the last 5 presidents. Providing a high-quality education for all children is critical to America's economic future. Our nation's economic competitiveness and the path to the American dream depend on providing every child with an education that will enable them to succeed in a global economy that's predicated on knowledge and innovation. So in that context of those platitudes, let's go back to the title of my talk, which is, Can Education Solve Growing American Inequality? And what is that question? Let me do the teacherly thing and sort of peeling that open. There are really 3 parts to that question. One part is education, and I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by education. And the second is solve, which presumes that there's some kind of a connection between education and inequality, economic and political inequality. And the third is this growing inequality, sort of be clear on what it is. So I'm going to do those 3 things in about 15 minutes. And here for the students from my education policy class, I'm stealing from something that they're very familiar with. There's a scholar up at Stanford named David Libey, who is a historian of education, and he has a marvelous piece that everybody should read about what the goals of American education are. And he looks across American history, and he says that generally we pursue 3 different kinds of goals. One is what we call democratic equality, which is the notion that we want to have a functioning democracy and educate citizens. And that's a public good that we all share. Living in a country where people are capable of self-government is something that we share. But it's a political public good. And what Libey is trying to do is distinguish between economic goods and political goods. He's also trying to distinguish between public goods and private goods. Private goods are things that I can have to myself, and it's divisible. I can have it and you don't. It's a zero-sum kind of thing. And democratic equality is not a private good. Similarly, when we look at our education system, Libey notes that many Americans advocate for social efficiency. That is, that we want to have an education system that prepares people to be successful in the economy and be productive workers so that we can live in a prosperous country that is competitive globally. That's the language that Barack Obama was using in that quote. That's the language of social efficiency. But we also talk a little bit about social mobility, and this is where the American dream comes in, that we have an education system that focuses on the interests and values of the individual student and that student's family. And what we want in education is to recognize and reward merit, where if people work hard and play by the rules and succeed, that they should be able to get ahead in a system which is stratified and unequal. These are not the only goals. I mean, we have lots of other goals, to have healthy children, to have children who are safe from crime, you can go on and on. But Libey, I think, correctly points out that when we think about K through 12 education, these are the most important things that we want to achieve. The other thing to note here, and I won't go into this in great detail, but I think it's self-evident from just looking at those that those don't all point in the same direction. It's very difficult to pursue any two of them without causing significant expense to the third. Any pair of them can sometimes be reconciled in some fashion, but all three of them can't. And so the American education system is a very confused business. We are trying to, there are lots of dilemmas and conflicts inside of it. And to try to pursue any single goal within it requires that we neglect other goals that we hold dear. So in that context, what might education have to do with inequality? Think it through. Let's take each of these in turn. So civic education, democratic equality. The idea is that education creates citizens capable of self-government. What does that have to do with inequality? Possibly, we could believe that democratically enacted policies, those that civically capable Americans choose, would reduce stratification and inequality. That's possible, but that's not necessarily where civic education is going to lead. Democratic equality in provision doesn't necessarily lead to any kind of effects on inequality in the broader society. So let's think about another public good here, this idea of social efficiency, that we want to have productive workers in an economy. The idea is that education creates a globally competitive workforce, workers who generate a prosperous economy for the nation. There's no obvious relationship between that and inequality. In fact, one of the ideas here is the sort of scientific sorting machine, that we have tracked education, and not everybody can go to college, right? The idea is that you want to feed children into labor markets that need them. We reproduce the needs of the labor markets by doing this. That's the notion of social efficiency. You have an education system that feeds the demands of labor markets. Its effects on inequality, are unspoken. So let's think about sort of education as a private good and go to the lower right-hand quadrant here. When we think about social mobility, we're openly recognizing that education is a private good. That is, if you work hard and play by the rules, you will get ahead. That's the other joke about the two campers, right? You mostly know this, right? The two campers wake up in the middle of the night. One of them wakes up and sees the other one is tying on his shoes. And he says, what are you tying on your shoes for? And he says, I heard a bear out there. And they said, well, why are you putting your shoes on? You can't outrun a bear. He said, well, I don't have to outrun a bear. I just have to outrun you. That's social mobility. Right? If one, in a stratified system, if one person goes up, another person must go down. Upward mobility requires downward mobility. And we may want to not think about that very much. We kind of avert our eyes because we don't like to think about who lacks merit or what it means to lack merit in a stratified economy, and who is downwardly mobile, why, and what impact it has on their lives. Another way of thinking about this, there's an education scholar named Dick Elmore who was talking about the effects of graduating from high school and not graduating from high school. And if you hold a kid back 1 year, the likelihood that they'll graduate drops by about 20%. If you hold a kid back 2 years, the likelihood that they're going to graduate drops by about to about 10%. They're probably not going to graduate if you hold them back 2 years. So Elmore says, these are children. These are children. The effect of not graduating from high school, when he told this story about 20 years ago, in lifetime earnings was more than $1 million. He said, in effect, you're fining that child $1 million for some way that they behaved when they were in school, when they were a child. Would any of us be willing to put into any situation where something that we did would lead to us being put at risk of being fined $1 million? That's social mobility. Okay, lower left-hand corner. Personal civic education prepares citizens capable of advancing their interests and values. I was on the debate team in high school. I'm standing in front of you because I have a PhD from the University of Chicago, and I got a tenure track job at Pomona College. 150 people applied for that job, and I got it. Right? There are a whole bunch of people who didn't get that job. Right? And where are they? I don't know. I'm right here. I'm talking to you. Right? Is there a link between that and inequality? I don't think so. I think it presumes inequality. It prefers inequality because then somebody can get ahead, right? So if we go back and think about Labourie's goals, if we're looking to the education system and mouthing these platitudes about how education is going to reduce inequality, I think we really need to think carefully about what we mean when we say that, because it's a problematic assertion. You've got to be really clear about what you mean when you say that. How will education reduce inequality? Let me spend just a little bit of time peeling this open when I think about the relationship between these two and more. Like, what do we mean by inequality? Well, my colleagues on this panel have mostly talked about income inequality. I'm only going to talk about income inequality, but there's also wealth inequality, as Professor Steinberger was talking about, and we'd have to look at pre- and post-tax and transfer inequality. I also want to talk a little bit more explicitly about political inequality, because Professor Ha talked about that, and that's important, of whether or not education can reduce political inequality. So one of the things that we know is when we talk about education and inequality, we presume that there's some sort of connection between somebody's education, what their skills are, and what they're paid for a living. And I just wanted to point out to you that the American education system has been producing more and more educated people pretty constantly as long as it has existed. There was, for a period of decades between the mid-1970s and recently, a decline in the overall graduation rates, but that was mostly about changes in demographics and who the people were that were graduating from schools. And in recent years, this is from EdWeek, you can see that the graduation rates from American high schools has been going up pretty steadily since the mid-1990s. That's at a time when worker incomes have been going down, right? So I want to point out that the education system is doing actually pretty well. And there are some returns on education. You can see here that the income levels of the people with different kinds of degrees are higher, depending upon what you have. So there is a return on that. But one of the things that I want you to note here is this is data that only goes up to the crash. This data stops at the crash. And for the 10 years before the crash, look at the income broken out by education level. There aren't returns on education. That even though the quality and substance of what these educational degrees and certifications provide is growing up. A high school diploma is harder to get now than it was 20 years ago. I won't say anything about a college diploma because I'm a college professor, but I know for a fact that getting a high school diploma is harder now than it was 30 years ago. And the returns on that in terms of wages, none. The economy continues to grow. It's above zero, right? So we have an economy that grows. Why? Well, some of it, this is a chart that everybody should have seen lots and lots of times. That blue line is the reason the economy continues to grow. And that's the output per worker in the American system. Goes back to just after World War II. Now, I want to respect my colleagues on this panel, but I defy you to show me the moment on that blue line when computers arrived. Technological change and productivity growth in the United States has been relatively constant since the end of World War II. The dramatic transformation of the income distribution in the United States that has happened since the mid-1970s doesn't show up on that blue line. It shows up on the red line, which is the median family income in the United States, which until the 1980s paralleled the blue line. That is, that workers received payment in the aggregate for the work that they produced, for the goods and services that they produced. There is a separation that begins to occur during the Clinton administration in a serious way. It actually goes back to the Reagan administration. And then at the beginning of this millennium, it completely falls apart. The link between worker productivity and worker income has been broken in the United States. Period. That doesn't have anything to do with education. In that context, education will not solve growing economic inequality. Some economists continue to claim that technology and globalization are the main factors that limit returns on work. And there was a panel presentation at the Brookings Institution on the Hamilton Project last year, led by Robert Rubin and Eric, whose last name I wouldn't begin to pronounce, and Andrew McAfee, that made this claim. In my view, as a student of political economy, that view is pretty thoroughly demolished. There's a report that was produced this past month, or in January, led by Larry Summers and a number of other authors, that said that the transformation of inequality and the stagnation of wages in the United States has happened at a time when there hasn't been some big change in the nature of globalization. Hasn't been some big change in the nature of technology. What Summers says is, unless you're going to be doing things that are affecting the demand for jobs, you're helping people win a race to get a finite number of jobs. Summers says the only thing that's going to fix this is tight labor markets and unionization, neither of which have anything to do with education. The takeaway for me of that is that education is not an economic problem. But go to the second kind of inequality. Now I'm at about 15 minutes, so I'll try and figure this out. It could be a distinct problem, right? There's deep political inequality in the United States, and Americans are exasperated by it and increasingly angry about it. It violates another aspect of the American dream, that the National Assessment of Educational Progress has a governing board that says each new generation is a new people that must acquire a knowledge and learn the skills and develop the dispositions in order to maintain and improve a constitutional democracy. So we want to have political equality in the United States. But we know that political inequality is growing just as economic inequality is growing. The two are closely related. You can see it in two forms. One is in the way people participate in our political system. Political representation through elections in our political system, the access to elected information, access to registration, access to voting, and voting are all stratified by income, by socioeconomic status. Research at the University of Michigan's American National Election Surveys will show you that. If you want to look at group representation, there's a marvelous study called The Unheavenly Chorus by Kay Schlossman and others that talk about representation through groups that shows a similar kind of inequality. And you don't even need me to talk about lobbying and campaign finance. You know how unequal that is. But it's not just about the inputs into the political system. It's about the outputs of the political system. That is, the preferences of people for particular policies. And there's a fascinating series of studies that's being done by Martin Gallenz that I would really recommend to you that you could go and look at. And what Gallenz does with some other colleagues of his is look at what the policy preferences of Americans are on a whole array of social and economic and cultural and educational and all kinds of other issues, and finds places where the preferences of the bottom 80% are different from the preferences of the top 20%. And what Gallenz finds is, on the policy questions in which low and middle income respondents' views differ from those of more affluent Americans, government policy appears to be fairly responsive to the well-off and virtually unrelated to the desires of low and middle income citizens. Where the policy preferences of the bottom 80% differ from those of the top 20%, the policy preferences of the top 20% are what gets enacted into policy. That's true for individuals. That's true for groups. You can just go Google Gallenz, Martin Gallenz, and this is great stuff. Methodologically extraordinarily rigorous and challenging. Hundreds and hundreds of issues, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation looking at how they vote. There is deep and growing political inequality in the American political system. It is closely tied to economic inequality. So, what are the takeaways? Education will not solve growing American inequality, either economic or political. But we should not blame schools for failing in this task, which is what most people do. Something must be wrong with our education system because there's growing inequality. We're not producing workers who are capable of being competitive in a global economy. Bunk. It's about globalization. Globalization is not a single thing. Globalization takes many forms. There are rules to globalization. It's not an all-or-nothing deal. You can choose how you do it. For example, the wealth that was created in the United States during the Great Compression in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was the wealth that was exported as capital, foreign direct investment from the United States. American workers helped to participate in the creation of that wealth, and it went into their pension funds, in the factories that they worked in the social insurance programs that they helped to invest in. And that money was taken out of the United States and invested abroad to enable foreign workers to compete with American workers. That was a particular approach to globalization. That was not the only way globalization could have been done. Globalization is not a monolithic, homogeneous phenomenon. You can do it in different ways. And we have been doing it consistently in ways that benefit people at the top of the income distribution and harm people at the bottom of the income distribution. And the preferences of the people who built this particular approach to globalization are being locked in by governmental policies that they're enacting through their own political influence, right? So that's the thing to fight. I mean, if you want to reduce inequality rather than trying to hope that somehow schools will do it. To give you some sense of the scale of what I'm talking about here, this is another thing that Larry Summers said this week. Somebody asked him, shouldn't we increase the earned income tax credit, which is a wage subsidy for people at the bottom of the income distribution? And you know, Summers said, we spend $50 billion a year on the earned income tax credit. And the largest proposal that I've heard is to increase it by like 20%, so it might go up to 60 billion or 70 billion. He said, if the income distribution pattern that existed in 1979 had stayed for the next 45 years, so that the pattern of the income distribution from then would be the one that we have now, the top 1% of people in the United States would have $1 trillion less than they have now. $1,000 billion. The people between the 80th percentile and the 99th percentile would have about the same, and the bottom 80th percentile would have $1 trillion more. That's $11,000 per year per family in the bottom 80% of the income distribution for 45 years. Sometimes we get overwhelmed by this, and we think that it has to be this way, right? It's too big to fail. We can't imagine that globalization and technology can take any other form than they do. But these are policy choices. We choose to do these things in these particular ways, and they can be changed. There was a major tax increase in the Affordable Care Act. I mean, we can enact tax increases. The sky didn't fall. But it won't be education. You should support education for other reasons because it is an extraordinarily valuable institution in our society. It's also an essential foundation of whatever inclusion and equity we are able to sustain in the face of growing inequality. So it deserves our support based on not on platitudes, but on our interests and values. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.